So just where is Benjen Stark anyway? This is one of the oldest mysteries in A Song of Ice and Fire, considering that Benjen went missing pretty early on in the first book, and at the end of book 5, we're still not really sure that we have any idea. I ended up talking about this briefly on a live stream a couple months ago, but I wanted to put out a video on it anyway, just to give my thoughts and sort of explain how I think we do have a good idea of where at least George originally intended Benjen to be, but whether or not that'll still be the case, I don't know. But I wanted to quickly break down the different options that we have and give the evidence that I see for why I've settled on the one that I have. So that's what we're going to do in today's video. I do think we have a pretty likely answer as to where Benjen ended up going, and there's only really a few places that he could have ended up going at first when he disappeared, but given that it's been so long, he could have gone many other places since then, and people have speculated lots of wild things. But at least in terms of where Benjen went when he initially disappeared, I do think there are enough little clues that we have a first option that we're meant to piece together as being the most likely. So Benjen Stark went north of the wall with a ranging party in search of whatever was going on with the wildlings and Mance Rayder. They still didn't have much information about that, and Benjen was the guy that they sent to figure it out. A few members of his ranging party shortly after that turned up dead near the wall, which is obviously not a good sign for Uncle Benjen. And what's worse is these two were actually not just dead, they were wights. They were wights who obviously had been turned when they were found, but they were sitting there playing dead if you read the scene in hindsight. Their eyes are blue, even though they weren't blue before, and they're just laying there motionless until they're brought back through the wall, at which point they get up and attack Lord Commander Jeor Mormont. This definitely raises the first of a few possibilities for what could have happened to Benjen Stark. He could have been killed by the others and potentially risen as a wight somewhere still north of the wall. If you're making your short list of the plausible places that Benjen Stark could have ended up, that's definitely on the list. There is something very weird though about this wight attack when you start to look at it a little bit deeper. It only really serves to actually just secure Jon's place as the next Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Just before this, he had attacked Sir Alliser Thorne because Alliser Thorne called him a traitor's bastard, and he basically tried to stab the guy in the face and was held back by his brothers. This has gotten Jon in a ton of trouble. Jeor Mormont thinks, oh, I was wrong about you. Basically, Jon's about to be demoted and not be next in line to eventually become Lord Commander. But because he saves Jeor Mormont on the exact same night from this wight attack, well, suddenly he's got all that clout back, the entire watch thinks of him as a hero, and he's right back on track to becoming the eventual Lord Commander. This was the kind of thing that I was talking about when I did that whole live stream about Jon, because it seems that the old gods, or at least someone, is definitely manipulating many events to make sure that Jon Snow ends up on this path to being Lord Commander. Later on, Jon Snow will eventually desert the Watch, and he's only ever found because he's hiding off in the woods and his friends are trying to find him, and they're about to ride past, and suddenly Ghost springs up out of nowhere and scares Jon's horse into making a noise, which allows his friends to find him and bring him back to the wall. Much later on, when Stannis is at the wall, he wants to make Jon Snow his Warden of the North, and he offers him to rule Winterfell and marry Val and basically everything that Jon could possibly want, and it's only when Ghost shows up again out of nowhere that Jon Snow, for some reason after petting Ghost, makes up his mind that, you know what, I should stay at the wall, which seems like a really bad situation, rather than go rule Winterfell, which seems like a pretty good situation. And of course, when Jon Snow is actually elected Lord Commander, it's the fact that the Lord Commander's raven flies up out of a kettle and circles the room and lands on Jon Snow's shoulder that wins everyone over to his side. It's also worth noting that it's Ghost and that raven in that initial wight attack that we're talking about that alert Jon Snow to the fact that anything is going wrong just in the nick of time for him to be able to save the Lord Commander. So it would seem that basically it's this Raven and Ghost that are constantly manipulating events surrounding Jon Snow to eventually make him the Lord Commander and keep him on the path that he's actually on in the books. The reason for this little tangent, though, is to just say that it seems like something weird is going on with this wight attack that is using members of Benjen's party. So is this actually the others that are animating these wights, or could it potentially be someone else? Because later on in the story we see Coldhands, who seems to basically be a wight, who seems to be not under the control of the others. So, something that does kind of make a little bit of sense is that whoever's controlling these wights may be someone who is trying to manipulate things in the favor of Jon, rather than actually trying to kill Jon or kill the Lord Commander. So, if we have a reanimated dead guy who is sort of serving as Bran's guide to get him to the Three-Eyed Crow and also helped Sam get south of the wall safely, It certainly seems that somebody else has some ability to reanimate and potentially control dead people. And they definitely seem to be using these reanimated dead people to further their ends, whatever those are. So, as I said, there's a chance that Benjen's party was basically wiped out by the others and all turned into wights, but there are other explanations for how this could have ended up happening that two of these members of his party turned up as wights here outside of the wall. Now, it is worth noting that Coldhands is seemingly working with Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest, so if there's another faction who has this ability to control wights on some level, it would seem that it is the Children and their Green Seers, which is a very interesting wrinkle to throw into things because I actually think that the most evidence we have says that Benjen Stark probably was at some point or another taken in by the Children of the Forest. Just to quickly throw out all of the options, basically our options are, since he's north of the wall, he was killed by the others, he was killed or taken in by the wildlings, he was, just off on his own, still ranging, surviving, just on his own, scouting this entire time, or he was taken in by the children of the forest. Those are basically the four ways that this could possibly go. There are only so many places you can end up north of the wall. Either he's still on his own or he's with one of the several groups north of the wall. Now, the reasons that I brought up in a previous live stream that I think it's most likely he's with the Children of the Forest are because, well, when they get to the Fist of the First Men, when they're searching for Uncle Benjen, and this is one of the last places that they sort of have found any evidence of him, they find a new Night's Watch cloak, and it's notably a new cloak, and wrapped in it, buried in the snow for ghosts to find, is a bunch of dragon glass weapons. So these are the weapons of the Children of the Forest, wrapped up in a new Night's Watch cloak, and buried intentionally to be found by the Night's Watch. So, this on some level or another seems to imply that the Children of the Forest are acting with intention, along with a member of the Night's Watch who has recently gone missing, or at the very least has, recently given them a cloak. So, Uncle Benjen fits that description pretty well, and him being with the Children of the Forest is definitely hinted at by this find of weapons at the Fist of the First Men. The other little bit of evidence that we have for this is when Bran and Robb are first told that Benjen is missing, Bran, just without really thinking, blurts out, "The children of the forest will help him," because he's heard the stories of the last hero, and apparently that's a thing that can happen when you go missing north of the wall, the children of the forest could help you. Which actually we see is really truly the case because Bran ends up north of the wall and he's taken in by the children of the forest as well. When he first says that line in book one, we're meant to sort of laugh it off, but by the end of the books that we have so far, it's definitely not something to laugh at. It's actually a very plausible explanation. So we have multiple clues pointing towards one of the most plausible explanations, and I think that, yeah, it's probably the most likely that Benjen Stark was taken in by the children of the forest. At the very least, that seems to be the answer that George is at least nudging us towards, right? He gives us a few little hints of Benjen possibly meeting up with the children of the forest, and the one hint that he gives us that maybe his party was killed completely by the others, well, upon further examination, it might not even be serving the goals of the others, it may be serving the goals of whoever's manipulating Jon to becoming the Lord Commander, which may be Bloodraven or maybe a future Bran, both of whom would be working with the children of the forest. So I would say that somewhere between most of the clues and all of the clues as to what happened to Benjen Stark point in the direction of him meeting up with the children at least at some point. So then what happened to Benjen once he met up with the children of the forest? Because Bran has arrived in the cave with Bloodraven, and at least in the first chapter that we have, Benjen is not there. It is definitely worth noting, though, we've only had one single chapter there, and Leaf says that the caves are so vast and endless that even her people who have lived there for a million years haven't explored them all, so Benjen could definitely be hanging out with some children of the forest in some weird little cave that Bran hasn't yet explored, or Hodor hasn't explored and Bran hasn't seen through his eyes. So Benjen could definitely still be in the cave, and maybe this will be something that could be revealed in Bran's first chapter of the Winds of Winter. I think there was supposed to be a fourth chapter for Bran in Dance with Dragons that ended up getting pushed to the next book, and it would be a pretty crazy reveal that would really kick things into gear for the Winds of Winter if Bran was able to meet up with Benjen right away in that chapter. So I do actually have like some percentage of the pie chart of possibilities pointing towards the idea that yeah, Benjen might be hanging out somewhere in that cave with the children of the forest, yet to be revealed when Bran eventually finds him. I don't think it's the most likely thing in the world, but just because Benjen wasn't there to like greet Bran at the door doesn't mean that he's not there somewhere. Also, we need to address the undead elephant in the room that is Coldhands, because in the television show, obviously, Coldhands was turned into Uncle Benjen. And we know that when George's editor first read about Coldhands, she asked, "This is Benjen, right?" And George said no. So George has basically directly said this is not Benjen, and I do think it would be a little bit of a cheap out if Bran didn't recognize his uncle the entire time that they were traveling together. And when Leaf is talking about Coldhands, she says that he was killed long ago, and she's a several hundred-year-old child of the forest, so long ago to her definitely feels like it would be longer than the couple years that Benjen's been missing. The final nail in the coffin, though, in my opinion, because you could say, okay, maybe George is lying to his editor for some random reason, maybe all this other stuff is explainable, but what really doesn't seem explainable by this being Benjen is the fact that when he actually kills the elk, he whispers some prayer in some language that Bran doesn't know, implying that he speaks probably the first tongue, which is a language that Bran doesn't know, or some other language, maybe the language of the children of the forest, I guess. But in either case, I really don't think that Benjen knows any secret languages that Bran wouldn't know, and this also again definitely points to this guy being someone who has been dead for a very long time, and once again, just not Uncle Benjen. I think that the television show made Uncle Benjen into Coldhands because they weren't going to do whatever George's actual reveal for where Benjen is in the television show, and they didn't really want to go into the explanation of who Coldhands actually was either, so they just combined the two, and that solved both problems for them. So, okay, he's probably at least at one point with the children of the forest, but he probably wasn't turned into Coldhands. Well, what is something else that Benjen could be doing with the children of the forest? This is where the imagination can sort of run wild, because you could say that maybe they gave him Dark Sister, which Bloodraven probably took to the wall with him and probably ended up in the cave with him, which Bran also hasn't seen in the cave at this point. And maybe they gave him Dark Sister so that he can be killing others, and maybe they sent him on a mission somewhere in the north, and, at that point he could be pretty much anywhere north of the wall, wielding a magical sword that could protect him from the others, and doing the will of Bloodraven and the children. Which is obviously a very interesting thing to think about, and definitely let me know down in the comments if you do think that's the case. What do you think the children would actually send Benjen to do? It is also possible that maybe Benjen is hanging around, maybe at the back entrance to that cave that Coldhands mentioned, or something like that, because, maybe Bran is going to need Uncle Benjen to help him get back south. Obviously, we know that the hold the door moment is going to happen in some capacity, and it would seem pretty likely that Bran is going to need to get back south, so just him and Mira trying to make it back south seems like it would be a bit difficult. Maybe Uncle Benjen can help pull the sled, who knows? There's also the very dark option of Benjen paste, which, if Benjen was taken in by the children of the forest and kept in that cave somewhere, many people speculate that they fed Jojen to Bran, so maybe they needed multiple sacrifices, or multiple sacrifices would make it more powerful, so maybe they kept Benjen around until such a time when they could feed him to Bran at the proper moment. I don't necessarily think that that's what happened, but it could be revealed to be the case in a future book, and it would sort of make some sense if they're feeding Jojen to Bran because he has some sort of magical bloodline. Well, a Stark is definitely someone who would have some magical bloodline, so maybe there's some weird, creepy magical benefit to feeding a family member to a future Greenseer. I don't really know, but if that is the case, well, Benjen is definitely someone who would qualify, so yeah, maybe. I don't know. As I said, I don't think that's the most likely, but it's something that I feel is worth a quick mention here. Now, I do actually have to bring up one other really interesting thing that could have happened to Uncle Benjen if he was taken in by the children of the forest. I believe in the television show when they talk about how he was turned into Coldhands, he was found dying by the children of the forest, and he says that they saved him by shoving a magical dragon glass piece into his heart. And basically, I don't think that's what's going to happen in the books, but a similar thing could have maybe happened. If they found a wounded or dying Uncle Benjen and wanted to do something to help him, they may have been able to use their Children of the Forest weirwood magic to guide him into the afterlife that many of the Children of the Forest seem to take on, and the afterlife that goes to many wargs. Because Benjen, even though I don't think we have any evidence that he's actually been warging in his life, he definitely has the genetics for it, given the fact that all of his nieces and nephews are able to do this. So, Benjen being able to go to the warg afterlife does make some sense, especially if he's with the Children of the Forest, who all seem to go to this same sort of afterlife and could help facilitate Benjen getting there as well. And what afterlife am I talking about? Well, it seems like when the children of the forest die, they go into ravens. Some of you might be saying, wait, I thought you go into the weirwoods when you die, and yes, they seem to believe that to be the case, but it also seems like they can inhabit ravens when they're dead as well. This is one of the crazy reveals that's dropped on us in Bran 3 A Dance with Dragons. When Bran is warging into these ravens that are in the cave, he sees that when he's in one of the ravens that there's someone else in that raven with him. And when he gets back, he asks Bloodraven about this, and he says that yeah, that's one of the children of the forest. She's been long dead, but she's now still in the raven like some shadow on a soul, basically the way that if Bran were to die, a part of him would go into summer when he died. Bran asks if all of the ravens have singers in them, which are the children of the forest, and Bloodraven replies, all, which definitely implies that, okay, there's a lot of children of the forest consciousnesses that are jumping around from raven to raven because, well, there's not that many children of the forest who have died recently within the lifespan of one raven, so it would sort of seem like if all of these ravens are inhabited by children, that would seem to require the souls of all of the children of the forest who have died over the course of thousands of years, rather than just the ones who have died within, as I said, the lifespan of these single birds. At least based on the text that we have so far, this seems to be the most reasonable explanation for what the afterlife of the children of the forest is like. They can sort of jump around the same way that Bran can from bird to bird, from animal to animal, not necessarily spending their entire afterlife inside of a tree or a second life inside of a single animal that they knew like a human warg might, but instead seemingly being a part of this hive mind which is going to persist and can inhabit animals. At least that's currently the way I read the situation, and the only way I can really make sense of the idea that all the birds have singers in them. This is something that maybe we'll have to get further confirmation of in future Bran chapters, but at least with all the evidence that we have so far, this is my best reading of how this whole thing works. You go into the weirwoods, but being in the weirwoods as this sort of disembodied consciousness seems to allow you some of the powers of skin changing that these greenseers who are also strapped up to the weirwoods would have. The other interesting thing that Bran learns during this whole training session with the ravens is that back in the day they wouldn't write the messages on paper and strap them to the legs of the ravens. It seems that they would warg into the ravens and then go and just relay the message to whoever they're trying to send it to. Bloodraven says that nowadays men have forgotten how to do this and they write the letters on parchment and strap them to the legs of birds who have never shared their skin. Which implies that these old ancient First Men kings, when they first started working with the children of the forest and were first living in Westeros, it would seem that this ability to warg into ravens was much more widespread, at least among the nobility. Which, again, as we talked about earlier, the Starks are definitely old ways nobility. So Benjen having this ability on some level, even if it hasn't expressed itself during his life, I think it makes a bit of sense. All of this basically to say that it would make some good sense if Benjen Stark is dead, that he is actually still somewhere in the story, potentially. Perhaps if a dying Uncle Benjen was found by the children of the forest, they could help facilitate his ability to join their normal afterlife where they're jumping around from bird to bird or inside the weirwood. That definitely seems to be a thing that at least can happen for magically powerful consciousnesses in A Song of Ice and Fire. Which perfectly sets up what I would consider to be at this point one of my favorite solutions for where Benjen could possibly be, and that is inside Lord Commander Mormont's Raven as his second life. This was something that was brought up in a few comments on a video I made about Lord Commander Mormont's Raven and all the weird things that it does and trying to figure out who was actually controlling this thing. I know that the typical solution is Bloodraven, and I think that is still fairly likely that it could be Bloodraven rather than Benjen, but at the same time, the wall does seem to block this warging magic ability, and most of the times that this Raven is doing suspicious things, it's on the direct opposite side of the wall from Bloodraven. So if Jon is cut off from Ghost when he's on the opposite side of the wall, well, would Bloodraven be able to warg this Raven? I think there are ways that maybe being strapped up into the weirwoods would allow him to bypass the wall's magic, especially if the wall is a line of weirwoods, as I suspect that it is. But it is still possible that maybe there is a different solution besides Bloodraven as to who's inside this bird, and in my opinion, that could definitely be Benjen. If he ended up dying with the children of the forest at some point, well, then he could possibly go into the weirwoods and then potentially jump into this raven and start influencing things in the favor of Jon Snow. So we're going to take a look at some of those suspicious moments from the Raven that may point towards it being Benjen. But before we do that, just shout out to those people who brought this up in the comments because it was an idea that I had never considered before, and at first I was like, oh yeah, that's pretty interesting, but I still kind of lean towards it probably not being Benjen inside this bird, but the more I've gone back through all these different times that the bird does weird things and looked at it, the more I start to suspect, maybe it does make some good sense for this to be Benjen. I'm still up in the air here, but I do want to take you through several of these instances with the bird and sort of give you my thought process on the whole thing. So, as I was trying to figure out how I feel about this idea, the first thing that I did is go and look and see, do we see the Raven acting weird at all before Benjen disappears? And the answer to that is definitely no. Benjen disappears pretty much right after Jon gets to the wall, and we don't ever see the Raven until Benjen has been long gone. The first time that the Raven appears in any of Jon's chapters, it's actually when they get the letter saying that Bran has woken up. The first time that the Raven talks is when Jeor Mormont pulls the letter out and is about to hand it to Jon. The Raven is saying corn, corn, corn. But then when he finds out that Bran is going to live, the Raven says, live, live, live. Now, this could definitely be just the Raven repeating one of the words that was just said, but it could also imply that whoever's inside of this Raven, if someone indeed is, well, they have some interest in Bran Stark living, which could be Bloodraven or it could be Benjen. The next big interaction with the bird that we have is when Jon Snow is fighting those wights that are attacking Lord Commander Mormont. Ghost is the one who originally gets Jon's attention because Jon's been confined to his quarters, but Ghost is freaking out and scratching at the door, and so Jon opens the door and finds that the people who have been set to guard him have been murdered. So he follows Ghost up to the Lord Commander's tower where the Raven is shrieking, and so it's Ghost and this Raven that draw Jon's attention so that he can even get there and save Lord Commander Mormont from the wights. As a lot of this is going on, the Raven is mostly just screaming corn, corn, corn to get everyone's attention, but then when actually Jon is fighting the wight, the Raven is the one who screams burn, burn, burn. So basically this bird is the one who sort of tells Jon how to kill the wight. So this is a pretty obvious situation of magical animal manipulation that's causing Jon to be the one to save Lord Commander Mormont, and basically this bird is the one who gives the instruction manual for how to do this, so on some level or another this bird is very clearly trying to help Jon Snow, and this could again be attributed to either Benjen or Bloodraven being inside of the bird. I think you'll notice as we go through, a lot of this stuff is pretty ambiguous. You could pretty much always blame Bloodraven or a future Bran for any of this, but it being Benjen does read in an interesting way when you go back and look at some of these scenes. There is an interesting scene in the next Jon chapter where Jon says he had hoped for news of his father, and the Raven replies, Father, Father. And then Lord Commander Mormont basically tries to shut the Raven up by pinching its beak shut, and the Raven flies away a little bit. And then they talk about how there's no news of Ned, but Barristan Selmy has been removed from the Kingsguard, and Jeor complains that there's a boy king on the Iron Throne at such an important moment, and the Raven replies, Boy, 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 boy. This could be on some level read as the Raven taking some interest in Ned and what's going on down in King's Landing, but that could be from Benjen, that could be from Bloodraven or a future Bran, or it could literally just be the Raven repeating some words that was said in the previous sentence. As they continue talking, though, then Lord Commander Mormont pulls out a sword that he had found underneath his bed that he had forgotten about apparently until his chambers burned, and that sword is the Valyrian steel sword Longclaw, which he's had remade with a new direwolf pommel. He sets it on the table and says for Jon Snow to take it, and the Raven replies, Take it, take it, take it. And obviously, Jon Snow having a Valyrian steel sword is probably going to turn out to be pretty important in this whole story by the end, so on some level or another, it does feel interesting that this Raven is screaming, Take it, take it, take it. But again, it could just be repeating words from the previous sentence, or it could be Bloodraven or Bran, or potentially Benjen in this bird, but in any case, the Raven really wants Jon Snow to have a special magical sword. Jon Snow tries to push back a little bit because he's being given the ancestral heirloom of the Mormont house, but Mormont says, Spare me your butts, boy. I would not be sitting here if it were not for you and that beast of yours. You fought bravely and more to the point, you thought quickly. Fire. Yes, damn it, we ought to have known. We ought to have remembered. The long night has come before. Oh, 8,000 years is a good while to be sure. Yet, if the Night's Watch does not remember, who will? Who will? Chimed the talkative Raven. Who will? Which is a little bit interesting because the Raven is the one that seems to have remembered that. Then, when they're talking about the sword's name, Lord Commander Mormont says that it was named Longclaw, and the Raven replies, Claw, Claw. And Jon Snow decides that, yeah, Longclaw is still a good name for it. I don't know if that necessarily matters, but just in general, this Raven really takes a big interest in Jon getting this Valyrian steel blade. The next moment that I want to point out is at the end of A Game of Thrones in Jon's last chapter when Lord Commander Mormont is explaining that they're going out on the Great Ranging. The cold winds are rising, Snow. Beyond the wall the shadows lengthen. Cotter Pike writes of vast herds of elk streaming south and east towards the sea, and mammoths as well. He says one of his men discovered huge misshapen footprints not 3 leagues from Eastwatch. Rangers from the Shadow Tower have found whole villages abandoned. and at night Sir Denys said that they see fires in the mountains, huge blazes that burn from dusk till dawn. Corin Halfhand took a captive in the depths of the gorge, and the man swears that Mance Rayder is massing all his people in some new secret stronghold he's found. To what end the gods only know. Do you think your Uncle Benjen was the only ranger we've lost in this past year? Jen, the raven squawked, bobbing his head, bits of egg dribbling from his beak. Benjen, Benjen. So this is the first time that the raven specifically seems to take an interest in Benjen Stark, and again, this could be just coincidence, it could be Bloodraven or future Bran, but if that is Benjen in the bird, this would be a little bit interesting. And it's not the only time that we're going to get the bird saying something suspiciously Benjen adjacent, as we'll see in A Clash of Kings here. The bird says a few interesting things as they're going on the ranging, but none of them more interesting in my opinion for this mystery than what happens when they're at the Fist of the First Men, so I'll read for you now how this little exchange goes. Keeping in mind that one of the reasons that they're supposedly out on this great ranging is to find Benjen Stark, in addition to figuring out what exactly is going on with Mance and all the wildlings. They're establishing their camp on the Fist of the First Men, and Jeor Mormont wants all of his rangers who are out hunting for game and looking for any clues of anything to stay within sight of the Fist so that they can't possibly be lost, because he's not willing to lose any more men. So here's how this little exchange goes, starting with Mormont talking to Jon and asking, "You think I'm wrong to keep the rangers close?" "That's not for me to say, my lord." "It is if you're asked. If the rangers must stay in sight of the Fist, I don't see how they can hope to find my uncle," Jon admitted. "They can't." The raven pecked at the kernels in the old bear's palm. 200 men or 10,000. The country is too vast. The corn gone, Mormont turned his hand over. "You would not give up the search." "Maester Aemon thinks you clever." Mormont moved the raven to his shoulder. The bird tilted its head to one side, little eyes a-glitter. "The answer was there. Is it? It seems to me that it might be easier for one man to find 200 than for 200 to find one." The raven gave a cackling scream, but the old bear smiled through the gray of his beard. "This many men and horses leave a trail that even Aemon could follow. On this hill our fires ought to be visible far off as the foothills of the Frostfangs. If Ben Stark is alive and free, he will come to us, I have no doubt." "Yes," said Jon, "but what if—" "He's dead?" Mormont asked, not unkindly. Jon nodded reluctantly. "Dead," the raven said. "Dead! Dead!" "He may come to us anyway," the old bear said, "as Othor did in Jafer Flowers. I dread that as much as you, Jon, but we must admit the possibility." "Dead!" his raven cawed, ruffling its wings. Its voice grew louder and more shrill. "Dead!" So in terms of Benjen being inside this bird, this is one of the scenes that is absolutely the most suspicious. First of all, as they're talking about the mystery of where Benjen is, George is drawing attention to this raven and having it move to his shoulder and its head tilting, its eyes glittering, and Jon thinks the answer is there, right after they talk about the raven. But, of course, Jon is thinking about how the answer to the riddle that Mormont is sort of setting up here is in the riddle there, and he comes to the conclusion that it's easier for Benjen Stark to find them than it is for them to find Benjen Stark, so that's what actually is being talked about. But George could be doing a little bit of double meaning here when he says the answer is there, right after drawing attention to this raven as they're trying to figure out where Benjen is. Then, of course, comes the part where they bring up Benjen Stark potentially being dead, and the raven screams 5 times, "Dead, dead, 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 dead." So, if this is indeed Benjen inside this bird, and he knows they're looking for him, and he knows that he's dead, well, he could be screaming, "Guys, I'm dead." The answer's right there, I'm dead. Like, this whole scene, if Benjen ends up being inside that bird, will definitely be one of the strongest bits of foreshadowing throughout the entire series. That comes from Jon 4, A Clash of Kings, and then in Jon 5, A Clash of Kings, this is what Jon is sort of reflecting on. It was growing harder to cling to the hope of Benjen Stark's safe return. The cloak he had found beneath the Fist of the First Men could well have belonged to his uncle or one of his men. Even the old bear admitted as much. Though why they would have buried it there, wrapped around the cache of dragonglass, no one could say. So basically, this is sort of again just drawing attention to the fact that that cloak is definitely new enough to have been Benjen's cloak or from someone in his party. And as I said, it being wrapped in dragonglass is a mystery to them, but I think that we should probably take the hint from that he has at some point met up with the Children of the Forest because dragonglass is a Children of the Forest weapon. Also, as we'll find out in the later books, the children of the forest are very much still alive and out there doing things. So that's something that the Night's Watch doesn't necessarily know that we as readers now do. So yeah, it just feels like all of this is hinting towards at least Benjen has met up with the children, and if he is indeed dead, well then him being dead in a similar way to the children of the forest, aka inhabiting a raven, well it does just kind of fit to me. I don't want to necessarily go through every single little interaction with this raven just because it would make the video like an hour long, but at the same time, I would suggest you go to a search of Ice and Fire, just search for Jon's POV, and just search the word raven, and you can find pretty much all the interactions and make up your own mind on what you think is going on here. The next one that I do want to cover, though, is probably the most famous example of raven manipulation that we have throughout the entire story. This is when Lord Commander Mormont's raven pops up out of a kettle and circles the area and lands on Jon Snow during the Lord Commander election, thus telling pretty much everyone who's undecided that they should vote for Jon Snow. We still have a bit of a mystery as to who put the raven in the kettle, which is probably a mystery for another video, but it flies out, it lands on a table in front of Jon and starts saying, "Snow, snow, snow," and then it jumps and lands on his shoulder. And Jon O'Slint says, "Oh, this is some trick. The raven that Mormont had knew more words than that." At which point the raven asks for corn, and then when it doesn't get any corn, it says, "Kettle? Kettle? Kettle?" Thus proving to everyone that yeah, this is indeed Lord Commander Mormont's bird, and it has chosen Jon Snow. The Black brothers all take this as a sign, and the sort of stalemate in choosing a new Lord Commander is broken as they all vote for Jon. Now, one of the things that I talked about in my live stream when I talked about this months ago is that Benjen Stark, when he gets Jon to the wall, he sort of gives him that speech about, like, you get what you earn when you earn it, and all that sort of stuff about how the wall is a meritocracy, but that's just straight up not true, and Benjen knows that. Like, all of the people who are running the wall are basically from noble houses, and I think he knows that in the end, Jon Snow is going to get special treatment for being Jon Snow, a Stark of Winterfell, but at the same time, you can't tell the cocky 14-year-old who just showed up there that, hey, yeah, you're going to get special treatment. You want to teach them, like, hey, work hard, do the right thing, get by on your merit rather than on your name, because that is straight up good advice for someone arriving at the wall. But, behind the scenes, I'm sure he'd be talking to Lord Commander Mormont, and if he was like, hey, should I promote Jon Snow? Behind the scenes, Benjen's going to be like, oh, yeah, of course, Jon is great. Definitely, like, he should rise high in the watch one day. But to Jon Snow's face, he's got to be like, hey, you're only getting what you earn when you earn it. So, in this situation, I think if that is Benjen in the Bird, he would absolutely support Jon becoming the next Lord Commander if he had the opportunity to. So, this is another thing where it does make some sense if it's Benjen in this Bird, but it also would make some sense if it's Bloodraven or a future brand trying to look out for Jon in some way. As I said, I'm not going to read every little interaction, but this is the last one that I just want to quickly throw out there. This is at the end of A Dance with Dragons, right before Jon gets stabbed. It's like his second to last chapter. He's having a dream about fighting off the others atop the wall. This is the dream where he's armored in black ice with his blade burning in his hands. There's lots of cool prophetic stuff going on here, and he's woken up from this dream by the raven. As he's getting dressed, Mormont's raven is in the corner muttering, "Corn, then king, and Snow, Jon Snow, Jon Snow." And Jon thinks, that was queer. The bird had never said his full name before as best Jon could recall. The reason that I bring that up is because it somewhat seems like, by calling Jon Snow the king, at least seeming to call Jon Snow king in this instance, it could definitely imply that whoever's inside this raven has some awareness of R plus L equals J. And the few people who might have some awareness of that are, again, basically the same suspects that we've been looking at the entire time for who's in this bird. Future Bran, Bloodraven, or potentially Benjen. So at the end of my own investigation into who's inside this bird, I basically sort of am undecided. I think it's definitely possible that it's Benjen, it's definitely possible that it's a future Bran or Bloodraven doing all this manipulation, but whoever it is seems to potentially know about R plus L equals J, and definitely is looking out for Jon, definitely is trying to make sure he rises high in the watch, and honestly, when you think about it, it could be that multiple people are inside this bird because when Bran jumps inside a bird, he and an old child of the forest are sharing that bird at the same time. So if Benjen is living inside this raven, that doesn't even mean that Bloodraven or Bran couldn't jump in there and say something important when they need to. And in fact, that might even be the way that Benjen is eventually discovered. if Bran jumps inside Lord Commander Mormont's raven and senses that Benjen is in there the same way that he sensed an old child of the forest in that other raven. I think that if Benjen is dead, this is really the only really cool reveal way that that could ever come about, right? Like, either Benjen pretty much has to be found alive and doing something somewhat important or, like, somewhat interesting, or if he's dead, like, finding his body in Jon Snow or in Ghost wouldn't really be that satisfying after so many books of the mystery being there. But if we find him inside this raven and then we look back at every interaction with that raven differently since he disappeared, I think that would be a very George R. R. Martin sort of reveal and would be pretty satisfying. So just to wrap up, in terms of Benjen being in the Raven, I'm pretty much 50-50 on it, which is a fairly high percentage chance to give something in terms of like a theory for the future of the books, right? Like if it's a coin flip, that's like a pretty good odds of it being true. Most theories are like far less than that. So, yeah, Benjen might be inside this bird if he is indeed dead. If Benjen is dead, unless he's, resurrected as some sort of cold hands like figure, then he's probably in the bird. Or at least he's in some bird somewhere, and none of the other birds are really as plot relevant as Mormont's raven. If he's alive, he probably ended up with the children of the forest, and they probably have him doing something else. So basically, if I had to bet money on it at this point, I would say one way or another, Benjen Stark ended up with the children of the forest. Let me know what you think of any of that down there in the comments. Do you guys have any other ideas or any other cool Raven interactions that I didn't bring up? Any other ideas for where Benjen could maybe be or what they could have sent him to do? Or any reason to suspect that I might be wrong about any of this? Let me know down there in the comments, and I'll be back with something else very soon.